The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds of Windsor Castle as Princess Charlotte made her way through the garden pathways. At 8 years old, she had already developed a keen sense of observation that often surprised the adults around her. Her bright blue eyes took in every detail of her surroundings, from the way the morning dew clung to the rose petals, to the subtle movements of the palace staff going about their daily routines. On this particular Tuesday morning in late spring, Charlotte noticed something different about one of the royal guards stationed near the East Terrace. Guard James Mitchell had been part of the royal protection detail for nearly 3 years, but today there was something in his posture that caught the young princess's attention. While he maintained the rigid, stoic stance required of his position, Charlotte could see the slight tremor in his hands and the way his eyes occasionally darted toward his phone, which was tucked discreetly in his jacket pocket. The princess had always been fascinated by the guards who protected her family. Unlike many children who might find their silent, unmoving presence intimidating, Charlotte saw them as real people with real lives beyond their ceremonial duties. She had often wondered what they thought about during those long hours of standing perfectly still, what worries they carried, and what brought them joy when they weren't wearing their formal uniforms. As she walked past Guard Mitchell, Charlotte slowed her pace deliberately. She had learned from watching her parents and grandparents that sometimes the most important communications happened without words. The way her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth, could convey entire conversations with just a look, or how her father could show approval with the slightest nod. These subtle forms of communication fascinated her. Guard Mitchell was struggling that morning, though he would never let it show in any obvious way. His younger sister Emma had been in the hospital for 2 days following a serious car accident, and the doctors were still uncertain about the extent of her injuries. As a member of the Royal Protection Detail, he couldn't simply request time off for personal emergencies. His duty to the royal family came first, and he had sworn an oath to maintain his post regardless of personal circumstances. The night before, he had received a text from his mother explaining that Emma had been asking for him repeatedly. She was scared and confused, and the familiar face of her big brother might help calm her anxiety. The message had kept him awake most of the night, torn between his professional obligations and his deep love for his sister. He had joined the Royal Guard not just for the honor and prestige, but because the steady income helped support his family, including Emma's university tuition. Charlotte's steps became even slower as she approached the guard's position. She could sense something was wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what it was. Her intuition, which had been remarkably sharp even as a toddler, was telling her that this particular guard needed something, though she wasn't sure what. The princess had witnessed many formal interactions between her family and the staff over the years. There were proper protocols for everything: how to address different members of the household when it was appropriate to speak and when silence was required. She had learned that royal guards were never supposed to initiate conversation or show any personal emotions while on duty. They were meant to be like living statues, present but invisible, protective but unobtrusive. However, Charlotte had also learned from her parents about the importance of compassion and human connection. Her mother, Catherine, had always emphasized that their privileged position came with the responsibility to care about others, especially those who served and supported their family. Her father, William, had shown her through his own actions that true leadership meant paying attention to the people around you and responding to their needs when possible. As she drew closer to Guard Mitchell's position, Charlotte made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. Instead of simply walking past with a polite nod as she had been taught, she stopped directly in front of him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The guard maintained his forward-facing stare as protocol demanded, but Charlotte could see his eyes flicker with uncertainty about what she might do next. The morning breeze rustled through the nearby oak trees, and somewhere in the distance church bells chimed the half-hour. It was one of those perfect English mornings that photographers love to capture, with soft light and gentle shadows creating an almost fairy tale atmosphere around the castle grounds. But in that moment, the beauty of the setting seemed secondary to the very human drama unfolding between a young princess and a worried brother. Charlotte took a small step closer to the guard and tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the kind of innocent directness that only children possess. She could see the tension in his jaw and the way he was working hard to keep his breathing steady and controlled. Without fully understanding the weight of what she was about to do, Charlotte was preparing to send a signal that would change both of their mornings in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Charlotte's decision came not from any grand plan but from a simple impulse of human kindness that her parents had nurtured in her since she was very small. She reached into the small wicker basket she had been carrying, originally intended for collecting flowers from the garden, and pulled out a single white rose that she had picked earlier that morning. The rose was perfect, with petals that seemed to glow in the soft morning light. Without saying a word, Charlotte extended the rose toward Guard Mitchell, holding it at exactly the right height so that he could see it in his peripheral vision without having to move his head or break his formal stance. It was a gesture so simple yet so profound that it immediately communicated everything she was trying to say. I see you as a person, not just a uniform. I notice that something is troubling you. You matter. The guard's training had prepared him for many scenarios: security threats, emergency protocols, crowd control, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. A member of the royal family was offering him a personal gift, something that went far beyond the normal boundaries of their relationship. According to every rule he had learned, he should maintain his position and ignore the gesture. Royal guards were not supposed to accept gifts, engage in personal interactions, or show any emotional response while on duty. But as James Mitchell looked down at the small hand holding the white rose, he saw something in Princess Charlotte's eyes that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about protocol and duty. There was genuine concern there, a kind of pure empathy that seemed to understand his pain without needing any explanation. In that moment, he realized that sometimes human compassion was more important than rigid rules. The seconds stretched between them like hours. Other staff members working in the gardens had begun to notice the unusual scene. A few of them stopped their work to watch, uncertain whether they should intervene or report what they were witnessing. Mrs. Henderson, the head gardener, paused in her rose pruning to observe the interaction with growing concern. She knew that any breach of protocol involving the royal children would need to be reported to their security detail immediately. Charlotte continued to hold the rose steady, her small face serious with concentration. She had learned from watching her great-grandmother that sometimes the most powerful communications happened in silence. The Queen had possessed an almost magical ability to convey support, disappointment, approval, or concern without saying a single word. Charlotte was attempting to channel that same quiet strength, hoping that her simple gesture would somehow reach through the formal barriers that surrounded the guard. Guard Mitchell felt his resolve weakening. The rose seemed to represent everything he was missing while standing at his post: the beauty of simple human connections, the comfort of knowing that someone cared about your troubles, the healing power of unexpected kindness. His sister Emma would have loved this flower. She had always been drawn to beautiful things, and even as a child, she would bring him dandelions and wildflowers from their backyard, declaring them the most precious gifts in the world. The memory of Emma's smile when she presented him with those childhood bouquets made his decision for him. Very slowly, so as not to attract too much attention from the other staff members, Guard Mitchell moved his left hand slightly away from his side. It was the smallest possible movement, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching carefully, but it was enough to signal to Charlotte that her gesture was welcome. The princess immediately understood. With the same careful discretion, she stepped forward just enough to place the rose gently in his partially opened palm. Their fingers brushed for just a moment, a contact that lasted no more than 2 seconds but somehow conveyed volumes of understanding between them. Charlotte had successfully communicated her compassion, and the guard had accepted it, creating a brief but meaningful human connection that transcended their formal roles. As soon as the rose was safely in his hand, Guard Mitchell closed his fingers around the stem and returned to his proper stance. To any casual observer, nothing significant had happened, just a small interaction between a princess and one of her protectors. But both Charlotte and the guard knew that something important had just taken place. She had seen his need and responded with kindness, and he had chosen to accept that kindness despite the professional risks involved. Charlotte stepped back to her original position on the garden path, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had learned something valuable about the power of simple gestures and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and compassion. The morning sun seemed a little brighter, and the birds in the nearby trees seemed to be singing a little more cheerfully. For Guard Mitchell, the weight of the rose in his hand felt like more than just a flower. It felt like hope. Someone had noticed his struggle and cared enough to reach out, even in the smallest way possible. The gesture wouldn't solve his sister's medical problems or change his work schedule, but it reminded him that he wasn't alone in his worry. Sometimes that reminder was exactly what someone needed to keep going through a difficult day. The morning continued with its usual rhythm, but something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between Princess Charlotte and Guard Mitchell. As she continued her walk through the gardens, Charlotte found herself glancing back occasionally to check on the guard. She noticed that while he maintained his professional posture, there seemed to be less tension in his shoulders, and the tight lines around his eyes had softened, slightly. What Charlotte didn't know was that her simple act of kindness had triggered a chain of thoughts in Guard Mitchell's mind that would ultimately lead to a much more significant breach of protocol. As he stood at his post, feeling the smooth stem of the white rose between his fingers, he began to think about the courage it must have taken for such a young person to reach out to someone she barely knew. Here was a child who could have anything she wanted, who lived surrounded by luxury and privilege, and yet she had chosen to pay attention to his emotional state and respond with genuine care. The more he thought about it, the more Guard Mitchell realized that Princess Charlotte's gesture wasn't just about giving him a flower. It was about recognizing his humanity in a system that often treated guards as invisible fixtures. She had seen past his uniform to the person underneath, the worried brother who was struggling to balance his professional duties with his personal concerns. That level of empathy and insight from someone so young was remarkable, and it made him reconsider his own assumptions about what was truly important. By mid-morning, Guard Mitchell had made a decision that would have shocked his supervisors and colleagues. He began to formulate a plan that went against everything he had been taught about maintaining professional distance and following protocol without question. The princess had shown him that sometimes human connections were more important than rigid rules, and he was about to prove that he had learned that lesson well. Meanwhile, Charlotte had continued her morning routine, but her mind kept returning to the interaction with the guard. She had been raised to understand that actions had consequences, and she was beginning to wonder what the consequences of her gesture might be. Would the guard get in trouble for accepting her rose? Had she put him in a difficult position by offering it in the first place? These questions weighed on her as she made her way back toward the main castle for her scheduled lessons. As she approached the East Terrace on her return journey, Charlotte was surprised to see that Guard Mitchell was no longer at his post. In his place stood a different guard, one she didn't recognize, who maintained the same rigid posture and forward-facing stare that all royal guards were trained to display. For a moment, Charlotte felt a flutter of panic. Had her gesture caused problems for Guard Mitchell? Had he been removed from his position because of their brief interaction? Her questions were answered when she spotted Guard Mitchell near the service entrance of the castle, speaking quietly but urgently into his mobile phone. Even from a distance, she could see that his posture was completely different now, more relaxed, more human, more like someone having a personal conversation rather than performing an official duty. Charlotte realized that something significant was happening, and her curiosity got the better of her caution. Instead of continuing directly to her lessons as she was supposed to do, Charlotte decided to investigate. She changed direction and walked toward a nearby garden wall that would allow her to get closer to where Guard Mitchell was talking, without being immediately noticed. It wasn't exactly eavesdropping, she told herself. She was just concerned about someone who had seemed troubled earlier. As she drew near enough to hear pieces of the conversation, Charlotte's eyes widened with understanding. Guard Mitchell was talking to someone at a hospital, asking about visiting hours and explaining that he had a family emergency. She could hear the emotion in his voice as he mentioned someone named Emma and asked about her condition. Suddenly, everything made sense. The tension she had noticed earlier, the worry in his eyes, the way he had seemed so grateful for her simple gesture of kindness. The guard finished his phone call and turned to head back toward his post, but he stopped short when he saw Princess Charlotte standing nearby. For a moment, both of them froze, unsure of what to say or do. Here was a situation that definitely wasn't covered in any protocol manual. A member of the royal family had essentially caught a guard abandoning his post to make a personal phone call, but instead of the anger or disappointment that Guard Mitchell might have expected, He saw only concern in Charlotte's young face. She looked at him with the same empathetic expression she had worn earlier when she offered him the rose, and in that moment, he realized that she understood exactly what was happening and why he had felt compelled to break protocol. Charlotte surprised him again by speaking first. Her voice quiet but clear in the morning air. She asked simply if Emma was his sister, and whether she was going to be okay. The directness of her questions, combined with the genuine care in her voice, broke down the last of Guard Mitchell's professional reservations. Here was someone who cared enough to ask, someone who saw him as more than just a uniform standing at attention. In that moment, Guard Mitchell made another decision that would have astounded his training officers. He began to tell Princess Charlotte about his sister, about the accident, about his worry and his feeling of helplessness at being unable to be with her when she needed him most. It was perhaps the most honest conversation he had ever had with a member of the royal family, and certainly the most personal. As he spoke, Charlotte listened with the kind of focused attention that adults often failed to give each other. She asked thoughtful questions and made observations that showed she understood not just the facts of the situation, but the emotional weight of his dilemma. In the space of just a few minutes, a formal relationship based on duty and protocol had transformed into something much more human and meaningful. As Guard Mitchell finished explaining his situation, Charlotte stood quietly for a moment, processing everything she had heard. Her young mind was working through the complexity of the situation. She understood that the guard had important duties to her family, but she also understood that his sister needed him. In her 8-year-old worldview, it seemed obvious that family should come first, especially when someone was hurt and scared. What happened next would become one of those moments that palace staff would talk about in quiet conversations for years to come. Princess Charlotte looked directly at Guard Mitchell and, with the kind of innocent confidence that only children possess, told him that he should go to the hospital to see his sister. She explained that if she were in the hospital, she would want her brother William to be there with her, and that sometimes being with the people you love is more important than any other responsibility. Guard Mitchell was stunned by the simplicity and wisdom of her words. Here was a child who had been raised in a world of protocol and duty, yet she instinctively understood that human compassion should take precedence over rigid rules. Her perspective was both refreshing and challenging. It forced him to question whether he had been so focused on following orders that he had forgotten the deeper purpose behind his service. Charlotte wasn't finished with her surprising declarations. She went on to tell the guard that she believed her parents would understand if he needed to leave his post for a family emergency. She had observed how her mother and father treated their staff, and she was certain that they would want him to be with his sister during such a difficult time. Her confidence in her parents' compassion was both touching and persuasive. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another staff member, Mr. Thompson, one of the senior palace coordinators who was responsible for overseeing the daily schedules and ensuring that all protocols were properly followed. He had been looking for Princess Charlotte when he noticed her deep in conversation with one of the guards, a situation that immediately raised red flags about proper boundaries and security procedures. As Mr. Thompson drew closer, both Charlotte and Guard Mitchell realized that they were about to face questions that would be difficult to answer. The guard's absence from his post, combined with the princess's deviation from her scheduled activities, would require explanations that might get them both in significant trouble. Palace security was taken very seriously, and any breach of established procedures was investigated thoroughly. But Princess Charlotte, displaying a level of quick thinking that impressed even herself, immediately took control of the situation. When Mr. Thompson approached and began to inquire about why she was not in her scheduled lesson, and why Guard Mitchell was away from his assigned position, Charlotte stepped forward and calmly explained that she had asked the guard to help her with something important. She told Mr. Thompson that she had noticed Guard Mitchell seemed worried about something, and that she had asked him to explain what was troubling him, because she was concerned about his well-being. Charlotte went on to say that when she learned about his sister's accident, she had insisted that he should be allowed to visit the hospital because that was what family members should do for each other. The audacity of her explanation left both men speechless for different reasons. Mr. Thompson was trying to process the idea that a young princess had essentially ordered a guard to break protocol and share personal information. Guard Mitchell was amazed by Charlotte's willingness to take responsibility for the situation and protect him from potential consequences. Charlotte wasn't finished with her bold intervention. She looked directly at Mr. Thompson and asked whether it would be possible for Guard Mitchell to have permission to visit his sister, explaining that she believed it was important for families to support each other during difficult times. She added that she would be happy to speak to her parents about the situation if that would help arrange for the guard to have some time off. The request put Mr. Thompson in an extremely awkward position. On one hand, he had clear protocols to follow regarding security assignments and staff schedules. On the other hand, he was being asked to consider a compassionate exception by a member of the royal family, albeit a very young one. The situation was unprecedented in his experience, and he wasn't sure how to respond appropriately. Guard Mitchell watched this exchange with growing amazement. Princess Charlotte was essentially advocating for him, using her position and influence to try to help him in his time of need. She was demonstrating the kind of leadership and concern for others that he had heard about in stories of great monarchs throughout history, yet she was doing it as naturally as breathing, without any sense of self-importance or expectation of gratitude. The morning sun had grown stronger, and the garden around them seemed to sparkle with an almost magical quality. Birds were singing in the nearby trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and lavender through the air. It was the kind of perfect English morning that poets wrote about. But the real drama was unfolding in the conversation between a determined young princess, a worried guard, and a flustered palace coordinator. Mr. Thompson found himself in the unusual position of having to make a decision that balanced official protocol with human compassion. Guided by the wisdom of an 8-year-old girl who seemed to understand intuitively what was right and important. The situation was testing everyone involved in ways they had never expected, and the outcome would depend on whether institutional rules or human kindness would ultimately prevail. Mr. Thompson realized he was facing a decision that would require wisdom beyond his usual administrative duties. Looking at Princess Charlotte's earnest face and seeing the genuine concern in her eyes, he began to understand that this wasn't simply a matter of protocol violation. It was about recognizing the human element that existed within their formal system. The young princess had identified a real need and was advocating for someone who couldn't advocate for himself within the strict hierarchy of palace life. After a moment of careful consideration, Mr. Thompson made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He told Guard Mitchell that he could arrange for emergency leave to visit his sister, and that another guard could cover his shift for the remainder of the day. The decision was made not just because of Princess Charlotte's intervention, but because Mr. Thompson recognized that good staff members deserve support during family crises, and that compassionate leadership sometimes meant bending rules for the right reasons. Princess Charlotte's face lit up with genuine joy at this news, and she clapped her hands together in a gesture of pure delight. Her happiness wasn't about getting her way or exercising royal privilege. It was the simple joy of knowing that she had helped someone who needed help. She immediately turned to Guard Mitchell and told him that she hoped his sister would feel better soon, and that she would remember both of them in her prayers. Guard Mitchell found himself deeply moved by the entire situation. In the space of just one morning, he had experienced the kind of human kindness and support that restored his faith in the goodness of people. He had seen a young princess use her position not for personal gain, but to help someone she barely knew. He had witnessed a senior staff member choose compassion over strict rule following. Most importantly, he was now able to be with his sister during one of the most frightening times of her life. Before leaving for the hospital, Guard Mitchell did something that was entirely outside protocol, but felt absolutely necessary in that moment. He thanked Princess Charlotte directly, not with the formal language typically used when addressing royalty, but with the simple, heartfelt words that one person uses when expressing genuine gratitude to another. He told her that her kindness had meant more to him than she could possibly understand, and that he would never forget what she had done. Charlotte's response was typically modest and wise beyond her years. She told Guard Mitchell that helping people was just what you were supposed to do when you saw someone in need, and that she hoped someone would do the same for her family if they ever needed help. Her words reflected the values that her parents had worked hard to instill in her. That privilege came with responsibility, and that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and compassion. As Guard Mitchell prepared to leave for the hospital, Mr. Thompson arranged for his replacement and made the necessary notifications to ensure that security coverage remained adequate. He also made a mental note to discuss the incident with his supervisors, not as a disciplinary matter, but as an example of how the royal family's values of compassion and service could be put into practice in their daily operations. Their walk back to the castle was different for Princess Charlotte than her earlier journey through the gardens. She felt a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a real difference in someone's life. The white rose she had given to Guard Mitchell had been such a small gesture, but it had opened a door to understanding and connection that had ultimately led to something much more significant. When Charlotte finally arrived at her scheduled lessons, her tutor noticed that she seemed more focused and engaged than usual. There was a quality of thoughtfulness about her that suggested she had learned something important that morning. Though the tutor had no idea what had transpired in the gardens, Charlotte threw herself into her studies with renewed energy, carrying with her the satisfaction that came from acting on her values and making a positive difference in the world. Meanwhile, Guard Mitchell was making his way to the hospital with a heart that felt lighter than it had in days. The white rose that Princess Charlotte had given him was carefully preserved in his jacket pocket, and he planned to give it to his sister Emma as a symbol of hope and kindness from an unexpected source. He knew that Emma would be fascinated by the story of how a young princess had noticed his worry and taken action to help him, and he looked forward to sharing that story as a reminder that goodness could be found in the most unexpected places. The incident had created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other palace staff had noticed the unusual events of the morning, and word began to spread quietly through the corridors about Princess Charlotte's compassionate intervention and Guard Mitchell's family emergency. The story became a topic of conversation that reinforced the staff's respect for the royal family and their appreciation for working in an environment where human values were considered as important as official protocols. By afternoon, the news had reached Princess Charlotte's parents, who were both proud and impressed by their daughter's actions. They recognized that she had demonstrated the kind of leadership and empathy that would serve her well throughout her life, and they were pleased to see that the values they had tried to teach her were being put into practice in real-world situations. 3 days later, Princess Charlotte was walking through the same garden path where her encounter with Guard Mitchell had begun. The morning was equally beautiful, with the same golden sunlight filtering through the oak trees and the same gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses through the air. But this morning brought with it a sense of anticipation and curiosity about what had happened to the guard and his sister. As she approached the east terrace, Charlotte was delighted to see that Guard Mitchell had returned to his post. He stood in his familiar position with the same professional posture she remembered, but there was something noticeably different about his demeanor. The tension and worry that had been so evident 3 days earlier were gone, replaced by a sense of calm contentment that seemed to radiate from him even while he maintained his formal stance. When Guard Mitchell noticed Princess Charlotte approaching, something remarkable happened. While he maintained his official position and kept his eyes forward as protocol demanded, a small smile appeared at the corners of his mouth, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking carefully, but unmistakably there. It was a smile that conveyed gratitude, joy, and a deep appreciation for the kindness he had received. Charlotte understood the message immediately. The subtle smile told her everything she needed to know about how his visit to the hospital had gone. She could see in his relaxed shoulders and peaceful expression that his sister Emma was recovering well, and that the time he had been able to spend with her had provided both of them with the comfort and reassurance they had needed. As she walked past Guard Mitchell's position, Princess Charlotte did something that had become their new tradition, though neither of them had planned it that way. She reached into her small basket and withdrew another white rose, this one as perfect as the first, with petals that seemed to glow in the morning light. Without breaking her stride or making any obvious gesture, she let the rose fall gently onto the path directly in front of the guard's post. Guard Mitchell watched the rose land near his feet with a feeling of warmth and gratitude that he struggled to contain within his professional composure. The gesture was Princess Charlotte's way of saying that she remembered their connection, that she cared about his well-being, and that she was happy to see him back at his post. It was a silent celebration of the successful outcome of their shared moment of human compassion. Later that morning, during a brief break in his duties, Guard Mitchell was able to retrieve the rose and add it to the small collection he had started keeping in his personal locker. The first rose that Charlotte had given him had been pressed between the pages of his favorite book, as a permanent reminder of the day when unexpected kindness had changed his perspective on so many things. This second rose would join it as a symbol of ongoing friendship and mutual respect. The story of Princess Charlotte's intervention had spread quietly throughout the palace staff, becoming one of those cherished anecdotes that people shared during tea breaks and informal conversations. It had become a symbol of the royal family's genuine care for their employees and a reminder that the formal protocols of palace life could coexist with authentic human relationships. Mr. Thompson had indeed spoken with his supervisors about the incident, but rather than facing criticism for allowing protocol to be bent, he had been commended for his compassionate leadership and his ability to recognize when human needs should take precedence over rigid rules. The incident had become a case study in how to balance official requirements with personal circumstances, and it had led to some thoughtful discussions about how to support staff members during family emergencies. For Princess Charlotte, the experience had been an important lesson in how small acts of kindness could have far-reaching consequences. She had learned that paying attention to the people around her, really seeing them as individuals with their own hopes and worries, could lead to opportunities to make a meaningful difference in their lives. The lesson would stay with her as she grew older and took on more official responsibilities within the royal family. Guard Mitchell's sister Emma had indeed been fascinated by the story of Princess Charlotte's kindness, and the white rose her brother brought her had become a treasured symbol of hope during her recovery. She had it pressed in a frame beside her hospital bed, and she told everyone who visited about the young princess who had cared enough about her brother to help him break protocol so he could be with her. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Princess Charlotte and Guard Mitchell evolved into something unique within the formal structure of palace life. While they maintained all the proper protocols and boundaries required by their respective positions, they had also established a connection based on mutual respect and understanding that enriched both of their experiences at the palace. The incident had demonstrated something important about leadership and human nature, that true authority comes not from the power to enforce rules, but from the wisdom to know when those rules should serve human needs rather than the other way around. Princess Charlotte, at just 8 years old, had shown the kind of instinctive understanding of this principle that suggested she would grow into the kind of leader who could inspire both respect and genuine affection from the people she served. The white roses continued to appear, occasionally on the path near Guard Mitchell's post, each one a small reminder of the day when protocol gave way to compassion, and when a young princess proved that kindness knows no boundaries of age, position, or circumstance. The simple gesture had created a lasting bond that would influence both of their lives in ways that extended far beyond that one perfect morning in the palace gardens.